Good morning, everyone. We're just letting a couple more people trickle in here and then we'll get started. I am Courtney Cheetah and I'm a program associate with Wild Farm Alliance. Joanne is at a conference day, so I'm filling in. Thanks for joining us today for the Whole Farm Sustainable Pest Management course. This is the fourth lesson of 12, and our mission here at Wild Farm Alliance is to promote a healthy, vibrant agriculture that protects and restores wild nature. And we help bring wild nature back to farms. Our 2050 vision is to see 1 million nest boxes and perches on farms, hedgerows of habitat the length of the moon to the moon and back to help support all the different kinds of beneficials on the farm, and to restore riparian areas because they're the lifeblood of the landscape. And we really see avian pest control as part of the toolbox for managing crops on farms. We have a field day coming up on November 21st at Lang Twins Winery in Acampo, and we'd love to see you there. We're offering 2.5 credits with the CCA and 1.5 credits with the DPR for this field day as well. And you can purchase a ticket for our field day on our website under the event tab. Today's webinar is Augmentative Biocontrol, Molds of Release and Types of Supportive Habitat. And we have Kim Horton, the agronomy manager at Taylor Farms, and Hannah Kahl, who is the ecological pest management specialist with CAF with us today. I also wanted to let you know that we'll be back in 2 weeks on November 20th on Wednesday with our 5th lesson, which is In the Field and Edge Beneficial Insect Habitat with Eric Brana and Tara Pisani Garu. And please consider attending all the rest of the lessons in the series. They've been really great. They occur about every 2 weeks through March. If you missed one of the earlier ones, they've been really great, and the recordings are all up on our website under the online courses, under the news and events tab on the wildfarmalliance.org website. And we're working on making sure we have continuing education credits available for all the classes. This lesson is going to start with Kim, so I will pass it over to her now.
Thank you, Courtney. I appreciate everyone coming on today, and I'm really excited to talk about this topic. It's near and dear to my heart. As Courtney said, I'm the agronomy manager at Taylor Farms, and previously before that, I worked on other large-scale farms, and I raised predatory mites and beneficial insects for about 20 years before that. So lots of experience with this topic. Let's jump right into it. So augmentative biocontrol, modes of release and types of supportive habitats. Let's start right away by talking about a review of biocontrol types. There's 3 main types. First one is conservation, which is the preservation of already present natural enemies. And next is classical, which is more where you're introducing a new natural enemy and trying to establish them for a population of exotic pests. A perfect example of that is on screen in this picture. You can see the cottony cushion scale and then the Vidalia beetle that predates upon it. You can look that up on UC's website for more details about it. And then the last type of biocontrol is augmentative. So that's what we're going to focus on today. It's primarily about mass rearing and doing periodic releases of natural enemies or beneficial insects, whatever you want to call them, essentially releasing the good guys to eat the bad guys out in the field. There's a link right here for suppliers for natural enemies. It's ambp.org. That stands for the Association of Natural Biocontrol Producers. And they have a great website that links you to insectaries throughout North America. And then there's also information on there. So it's a great resource. I also want to talk a minute about predator-prey interactions. So what can make releases difficult is sometimes because the reproductive potential of the pests is very high. You can see in the graph that the pest population increases very quickly in the spring, and then naturally the the predator population will come in a little bit later. So what we're doing with the augmentative releases is we're trying to get those two curves to line up closer. So how do we do that? Well, we do the releases. We want to think about how we can do a release and target multiple stages of the pests as well. So instead of doing just a single release or using a single type of biocontrol, you can think about layering practices. An example of that would be for diamondback moth. You could use mating disruption to disrupt the adults so that they can't mate and lay eggs, or have the females have viable eggs. You can also use Bacillus thuringiensis sprays, which can infect the larvae, or worms, as a lot of people call them. And then you can also use trichogramma releases, which is a parasitic wasp that will sting the eggs of the diamondback moth. So by layering biocontrol practices on top of each other, you can get an even better handle on the pest populations faster. So now let's talk about ways to optimize your farm for the releases. And I know I have farm here, but it can be also your backyard, your garden. It can be lots of different areas where these same principles apply. Essentially, almost every insect needs nectar or pollen at some point during their life cycle. So by adding flowering plants to the field or to adjacent areas, you can support the beneficial insects during that part in their life cycle when they need nectar and pollen. In addition, putting out these insectary plantings brings native beneficial insects into the field or to adjacent areas, and it keeps them there longer as well. And then when you do a release, it will keep the beneficials in the field longer. So once again, it's that stacking idea of you have multiple benefits by having the in-field or adjacent to the field insectary plantings with flowering plants. In this picture, it's a cauliflower field in Salinas, and you can see the alyssum transplants that are there mixed in within the crop. Some other examples of insectary plantings are, you can do a perennial insectary planting. These are all on the outside edges of fields. So we have a nice mix of sunflowers and wildflower mix down in our Las Colinas ranch on the left. Up in the middle, that's bachelor's button. That's just absolutely gorgeous. People would stop and take pictures all the time of this one on the edge. And then on the right-hand side, you can see some beautiful vetch and poppies and some mustard mixed in there. Once again, it's all perennial insectary plantings that support the beneficials during the growing season and then at other times of the year as well. On this slide, we have a perennial insectary planting on the left, and then on the right-hand side, this is a permanent insectary planting. So what we did here is we worked with the Xerces Society, and they sourced native plants for us. And then we planted them in an area that's not farmed. So why do you have not farmed areas? Well, either they're, in this case, they're extremely sandy and on a hillside, so it's difficult to farm. But you can find lots of areas on ranches where it's not farmed for one reason or another, and put in a permanent insectary planting that's adjacent to the farmed field. You can see our field ready to plant there in the background. This is in King City. So next, let's talk about getting ready for the release. So the number one most important thing you can do is correctly identify the pests that you have out in the field so you can make sure you're releasing the right predator. It's extremely important to do this. I like to tell a quick story. Many years ago, I was working in Florida. and had a grower called me. I shipped him ladybug larvae to release into his greenhouse to eat aphids, and everything seemed to be going okay. And then he called me and he said, Kim, my greenhouse is infested with aphids. So I raced up there to see what was going on, and his aphids were all parasitized by, a native parasitoid that was in the greenhouse. So the parasitized aphids look like they're in the top picture. You can see how the body of the aphid becomes golden and swollen. So then you know that the wasp larva is developing inside that aphid and it's no longer feeding on your plants. So once again, identification is key. We also need to know what the predator's host range is, the predator's host range. So you want to make sure that if you're using a parasitic wasp, it has the ability to sting whichever aphid you have in your field, because parasitoids can be kind of specific to different genuses of pests. You also want to think about disruptive influences out in the field. When I used to work in vineyards a lot, mealybugs were an issue, and ants would farm the mealybugs for their honeydew. And in herding the mealybugs, they would protect them from the predators attacking them. And the ants would actually can attack the predators, kill them, and carry them away. So be sure that you have, whatever is needed to keep other influences out of the field. We use a lot of overhead irrigation in our fields. So we always try to do an overhead irrigation prior to a release of beneficials. You don't want to do it the other way around because you can drown the beneficials, you knock them off the plants. It's just not optimum. If you're working with drip, it's great because you don't have to worry about any overhead. If you're doing releases more on a smaller scale where you're walking fields, you want to make sure that the people who are doing the releases have sufficient access. You don't want the field to be extremely wet and difficult for them to move around in, those types of things. And then the next key point is timing releases. I used to get this question all the time. When should I do the release? Well, the simplest way to put it is at the first sign of pests, you probably need to think about doing a release. Because once again, if you go back to that prey predator curve, we're trying to move the graph to the other way so that the pest can't get out of control before we do the release. So first sign of pests, pressure is when to do the release. I know with predatory mites, we usually say about 5% of the leaves that have presence, it's time to do the release. So it can vary, but that's a good general rule. I also always think about the harvest date of the crop. So if I'm 7 to 10 days from harvest, I'm not going to do a beneficial insect release because it's just too soon to see the positive effects that the release will have. You also want to think about pesticide applications that have been done prior to the release. There's some great information that Hannah is going to talk about next, where you can go on to certain websites and there are side effects manuals that will tell you if a product is kind of disruptive or very disruptive. It gives you a whole range. And then they also tell you persistence of the different active ingredients in pesticides. So you can know how long you need to wait to do a release after a spray. So once again, suppliers, I'm mentioning ambp.org just because that's a great group to go to. And they have a listing of all the different suppliers in North America. You want to be sure that you ask them about availability and pricing. So availability is one of those things where the sooner you know you want to do a release, call the insectary, let them know, because it takes time to rear beneficials to have them ready. It's difficult for a grower to call and say, okay, I need 3 million of something tomorrow. We need, insectaries need some lead time in order to get that done. So once you place your order and you receive your beneficials, I think a lot of times growers want to know how they can do quality assurance on the beneficials that they receive. So I'm going to talk about a guide that was developed by Vineland Research and Information Center in British Columbia. It's compiled by Rose Butenhaus, and it's just a great reference point. Uh, you want to think, you got to think when you're calling an insectary, rearing is difficult. You're often dealing with the pest, the predator, growing plants. Insects and mites do not behave in captivity the same way they behave out in the field. So it's a difficult process. And there's a lot of variability between suppliers, where they're sourcing from, carriers. There's a lot of differences. So you want to have all that information together. In addition, shipping issues can occur, right? The insectary can package it perfectly, and then the shipper, FedEx or UPS, gets a hold of the box and it gets delayed for 2 days because of winter storm. That's going to affect the quality of your insects. So when you receive your order, the first thing you want to do is right away open it up, and then you can use this grower guide to do the quality control checks. The first page of the grower guide talks about materials needed and protocols. So that's there on the left-hand side of the screen. It's general items that you can find or make, and you want to have these items available. And then you can go to each individual page of the guide for whichever beneficial insect or predatory mite purchased and run through the QC check so that you can make sure the products you received are healthy, in good quality, and ready for release. So after the release, you definitely want to be thinking that most releases, you don't do them just once. It's a lot like spraying organic pesticides. You usually don't spray just one time because of limited efficacy. So with releases, you want to think about it the same way. You do an initial release, you take the population down, and it's likely that you're going to do another release. You need to give the beneficials time to work. If the temperatures are cool, if it's really windy, if you're spraying for another pest in the field, all of those things are going to slow the effectiveness of the beneficials down. And then scouting for beneficial insects after a release. A lot of times, unfortunately, the way you know a release is working is just the lack of pests. The picture in the top shows a cabbage aphid colony, and then the picture in the bottom shows a colony that's been destroyed by syrphid fly larvae. And you can't really see the syrphid fly in that picture, but we know it was there because the population has been decimated by them. Also keep in mind that cannibalism can occur with beneficials. If they're in close quarters, they will definitely attack each other. Whichever one's the biggest will win. So the way to combat that is by having those flowering plants out in the field so that the beneficials can spread out and protect themselves from each other. Up here, GTI, Grower Transplant Inc., they actually offer a service where you can buy alyssum transplants with the transplants that you're receiving from them. And I'm sure other greenhouses would offer the same type of service if they were asked. So quickly, to finish up my takeaways, beneficial insects need, and predatory mites too, they need pests and flowering plants to thrive. What are augmentative releases? Well, you're adding mass-reared beneficial insects and predatory mites to your farming program. You want to make sure that you plan your release out in detail beforehand. All the topics that we covered, irrigation, timing, all that. You also want to QC your order as soon as you receive it. Don't let it sit there till the next day. Right away, look it over. And then be ready to do another release down the line, whether it's a week or 3 weeks from that initial release. You may need to tweak your rate, your timing, time of day that you did the release, but just be ready to do another release. So that's all for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kim. And if any of our participants have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We're going to launch a poll question or two here. And if you are requesting the continuing education credit, make sure that you answer these, and we'll just give it a minute for people to respond. And then I'll have you go over these, Kim. Okay, we're at 85%. Let's end the poll. And Kim, if you could go over those, that would be great. Thanks.
Sure. Well, I'm very glad to see everyone did well on my poll, so I must have explained things pretty well. So augmentative biocontrol, yes, it refers to releasing mass-reared natural enemies on a periodic basis. The other ones the other answers were the other types of biocontrol we talked about. And then secondly, the first step in getting ready to release natural enemies is to correctly identify pests and predators. I think I must have hit that home extremely well because no one had the wrong answer. So good job to everyone listening.
Thanks so much, Kim. And like I said, if you have questions, feel free to put those in the chat. And we'll come back for the Q&A after Hannah's talk. So I'll turn it over to Hannah. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here today. Let me just take a minute to get my presentation pulled up. Well, thanks so much to Kim for talking about some of the background on beneficial insect releases. I'm really going to focus on modes of releasing the different beneficial insects. And I just want to also mention that please reach out to me for questions. My email is here. A lot of what I'll be talking about is from my experience releasing beneficial organisms on a variety of different systems, on small scale farms and larger scale farms. So before really starting to talk about different ways you can release beneficial insects, I'm going to start off by talking about some basic notes on natural enemy selection. Kim actually mentioned a lot of these, but I'm going to go into a couple of details on this just to give some more information about some things. So one thing to think about is that for the pests that you're targeting, you might want to really think about at what life stage that pest is most susceptible to natural enemies. And as Kim mentioned, you can also definitely target multiple life stages in many cases. So this is just a really great way to layer practices. Another thing to think about is if you are trying to target the pest life stage when it is, for instance, a larva that is in the soil, it's really important to choose a natural enemy that can access the soil and infiltrate that. So for instance, targeting housefly in the soil, you might want to go with something like entomopathogenic nematodes that can really get into the soil and target that pest. Another thing that I want to note is that both specialist and generalist natural enemies have their place in natural enemy releases. However, there are some differences in using specialist and generalist natural enemies. When you're using a specialist natural enemy, that natural enemy often needs specific pest species to continue to survive. And if that pest species isn't there yet, it might either not stick around or not be able to survive, although some specialists also definitely consume pollen and nectar at some points. Generalists, on the other hand, they can target multiple pest species at the same time. They also, because of that, can potentially be released even before a target pest species occurs. Because they can subsist on alternative prey in the system. This is particularly the case if you have a really complex farm environment that can support a lot of different natural enemies. And I do want to know a couple of different things about generalist natural enemies, though, that can be a little challenging. it is really important to find the right generalist natural enemy for the pests that you're trying to manage. That is very appropriate because there are generalist natural enemies that will consume other natural enemies. They may also consume other beneficials, and depending on the scenario, and they may also, in certain situations, consume even the crop plant, although this is rare. So, and this all won't happen if you choose the right generalist for that pest and for that system. And again, specialists and generalists can be used together, particularly if you have a complex farm system. You may want to do something like release generalists first before your prey is really built up, and then release some specialists. Climate compatibility is key. Kim talked to this. You want to make sure you're releasing natural enemies into an environment in which they can survive. Natural enemies have a range of temperature and humidity in which they can survive in. And if you release in an environment that is either too hot or too cold, that natural enemy will have a really hard time surviving. And it's important to make sure that they will be able to, again, contact that pest species. Tolerance to pesticides is often really key too. So pesticides in general will have an impact on the natural enemy that you're looking to release. There are certain cases, though, in which some natural enemies have some tolerance to pesticides. So this might be something to look into, particularly if you're releasing on a farm that is using broad spectrum insecticides, although it's best to try to limit use of broad spectrum pesticides and really look at how the impact of the pesticides will be on the natural enemies. One extra note that I want to make about specialist natural enemies is that they're often really well adapted and co-evolved to going after that specific pest species. For instance, there's predatory mite specialists that can navigate how to get into the web that spider mites leave and can consume them a lot more effectively because they can do that. But what is available is really important. So as Kim alluded to, not all natural enemies are available. You have to work with what you can get. You have to be sometimes flexible. What is available one year might not be available the next year. So you have to have a lot of flexibility in what you're planning. Price is also sometimes a consideration. Different natural enemies do cost different amounts, maybe something to consider. So if you decide you're doing a release, Kim also talked to some points about this, but I'm just going to review some of this as well about how to prepare for release, just more about some of the logistics. Kim mentioned this, but definitely call the insectary with plenty of time in advance, particularly if you're doing large releases. Also, if you can work with a company to do overnight shipping, that is definitely preferred. You want to reduce the amount of transition time that natural enemy is experiencing. If releasing with a drone, you also have to contact the drone company with plenty of time in advance. So this is when you have to take out the calendar and try to figure out timing for both the insectary, the drone, and then also the farm. And so it takes a lot of coordination. One thing to note is that if you are especially releasing on a bunch of smaller scale farms, you can consider joint purchasing to save on shipping costs. Shipping costs is a high amount of the cost for use of natural enemies. And so if you can reduce that, you can definitely save money. Some things to note about taking care of the natural enemies. I think that the guide that Kim provided goes into a lot of details on quality control, but just a couple of simple things to do when you receive natural enemies is if they come on ice packs, for instance, change out the ice packs, make sure that they are maintained in the same temperature in which you receive them. If you have a climate, or if you have a temperature controlled fridge that's pretty consistent, you can also use that fridge. It has to be set to the right range for that natural enemy. Oxygen is also something that you can make sure to do. This can be done while doing quality control for the natural enemies. So you can just pop open the lids and give some airflow and oxygen while checking to see that those natural enemies are vigorous. and making sure that they move when they start to warm up. So there's many different release methods for releasing natural enemies, and I just wanted to talk about a couple of the big ones. I wanted to note first off that not all of these methods can be used for all of the natural enemies. You have to make sure that the method is appropriate for the natural enemy, and that you can, in fact, use that method. For some natural enemies, there's only one method, for instance, that should be used. So first off, there is the ability to release with drones. And drone releases are often more cost effective at a larger scale. This is just a really rough estimate, but maybe if you're releasing on more than 30 acres, then it might make sense to consider or check out drone releases. Drones also provide uniform coverage, and it really eases access to the field. So Kim mentioned this. It could be hard to get into the field if the crop plants are planted really tightly or if there's too much water on the ground, and drones can get in there. But some of the downsides of drone releases are that they're not often not as cost effective if you're releasing at a smaller scale. It does require more logistics. It requires coordination with another company. And so you have to figure that out. It's also, there's less ability to customize sometimes based on observations. So if you know where the hot spots are and want to release at higher rates, it might be difficult to do that using drones. Might be able to work that out, but it might be challenging. It also, on the other hand, on the other side of the spectrum, you can release natural enemies just by using hand releases. And this means you just walk the rows and you either sprinkle out the natural enemy or let them fly out of the cup. Some of the advantages here is that this is cost effective at a smaller scale, and it might allow you to multitask. So if you are walking the block anyways, you might be able to, while doing the releases, also check the irrigation line, look for other pest presence, make a lot of other observations. Some of the downsides here is that this could lead to a lack of uniform distribution. It could kind of be clumpy, especially if you're releasing a natural enemy that does not fly. Many may be released on the ground rather than the crop plant, and you want the release to contact the crop plant so the natural enemy can find the pest easier. This is also not as time efficient on a large scale. I've done this. It takes a lot of time, especially if you're starting to walk a larger block. This release method is just releasing using a truck or ATV, and it's kind of just an extension of hand releases, but how it works is you can literally drive down rows depending on your crop system, have one person drive, and then you're doing the release out the window or out of the back. I'm not going to really review all the pros and cons of these next few methods because they're kind of related to hand releases, but this is more time efficient than hand release. But it might not be possible, safe, or easy to do due to the field conditions, layout, or crop. And also, you might actually want to be reducing the amount of passes on the field for reasons like soil quality. So this might not be something that you want to do. Another method that is a modified version of truck, ATV, hand releases is using these modified leaf blowers that kind of spit out the natural enemy. And there's many different forms of this. In this picture and in this video, it's loud. Sorry about that. But you can see Daniel Unruh, who's a walnut farmer, spraying out predatory mites from his reverse leaf blower using an ATV. And there's many other modes of this too. You can take a backpack blower and convert it to a reverse leaf blower. Or some companies make handheld reverse leaf blowers that are even up for sale. And I've had the really good fortune of working with like really creative growers and PCAs that have figured out different ways to modify releases for their system. And this is just an excellent example. One thing that this adds is uniformity and ease to releases by hand or truck ATV. So it's a really interesting method that can be modified to your farm. These next two are only available for specific natural enemies. And this is an optional hanging release box. Another thing that's sort of similar to this is there are some natural enemies that are reared on where the pest is reared on the bean plant and the natural enemy is also on the bean plant, and you put out the bean plants. That's kind of similar in some pros and cons, so I'll discuss them together. But this has more uniform and better contact with the crop plant than distribution by hand. However, for either this box or the bean plants, there's often extra charges compared to just bottles. Another method is using these slow release sachets. Again, only available for certain natural enemies. I've seen this for predatory mites, for instance. And this allows for more uniform distribution and contact with the crop plant again. But this is sort of indicated in the name that it's not as effective for active high infestations. It is a slow release. So you've done a release, now what? Kim alluded to this, but monitoring is key. Monitoring before the release, monitoring after the release, looking at what pests are out there after the release and whether the natural enemy established, although as Kim mentioned, they can be tricky to see. When you do a release, if it worked out how you wanted it to the first time around, that is excellent. If it did not, you may need to try again. Every farm system is a different system, and you might have to work out what works best for that farm. Some things to consider altering if the first release didn't work how you wanted it to is your pesticide choices. I'll talk more about this in a second, but pesticides have an extreme effect on natural enemies. They often impede their effectiveness and just even their mere ability to survive in the system. So you might want to look at using different pesticides, switching to softer pesticides, or reducing your pesticide use if you can. Natural enemy choices also can be looked at. You may want to look at using both generalists and specialists together, using a generalist earlier, or a specialist that's very specific for that pest and really co-evolved to target that pest. Rates may be may need to tinker with rates. This is tricky because in certain cropping systems, the rates are not really well worked out. So you might need to really figure out at what rates to use for your crop. Timing is key. You may have released too late when the pests have already built up in large numbers. Methods, you may have used a method of release that just does not work well for that natural enemy and pest. Ant management, Kim mentioned this. This is really key. Maybe if you notice you have a lot of ants out there and your release didn't work really well, then try to bring down your ant levels before releasing again. So there's many different there's a lot of pesticide information out there on how they affect natural enemies. And this is just a really important factor that can prevent successful natural enemy establishment. Some of these, I'm not going to go into a lot of details with these resources, and I really would encourage you to explore these resources on your own. But first off, there's UCIPM, which provides some basic information about pesticides and their impacts on natural enemies. Each UCIPM page has pesticides sorted from softest to more broad spectrum in terms of their impact to natural enemies and other beneficials. There's also the Copert side effect database, and this provides some added information, such as the length of time that pesticide can have an effect on different natural enemies, and also what life stages the pesticide might be impacting for the natural enemy. I've also heard that the BioBest side effects app can be helpful. I honestly have not used this myself that much, but I've heard of some people using this as well. And there's a lot of research papers out there about impacts that pesticides can have on natural enemies. This paper, for instance, looks at effects of a lot of different pesticides on predatory mites. And at CAF, we've created a resource to help especially walnut growers navigate this research paper and look at how their pesticides can be impacting natural or predatory mites in walnut systems. So with that, it's important to think about the what, where, when, how, and why of natural enemy releases. Use practices that would complement and buffer your natural enemy release. Monitor, and you may need to try again. So I'd just like to also thank a lot of people, and I can take questions if there are any.
Great. Let's actually launch the second poll questions. This is impressive. Our participants are really listening. They're all answering the same. Hopefully it's the right answer. Okay, why don't we close it? And Hannah, if you could go over those, that'd be great.
Yeah, it looks like everyone answered correctly for both questions, so that's exciting. So for the first question, what is a factor in short-term storage of natural enemies? That is, everyone answered correctly, it seems. Maintaining them at an appropriate temperature. So if they came out in ice packs, try to keep them cool. Change out those ice packs or get them in a appropriate fridge. What history about the release should be known before releasing natural enemies? Yes, pesticide use. Pesticide use has a big impact, and hopefully those resources I shared might be helpful to navigate that.
Great. Thanks, Kim. That was really interesting and fascinating. And if there are any questions, put them in the chat. I have a question for you, Hannah. Are there any tools that farmers can use to sort of predict when these pests are coming? Like, is tracking degree days helpful or anything like that?
Yeah, I feel like Kim and I could probably both speak to this, but degree day tracking can be really helpful depending on the pest and whether there is a degree day model built for that pest. UCIPM actually has part of their pages, they have resources where you can calculate degree days for that pest and in your location, and they can tell you how development of that pest is proceeding according to the temperature. And it often tracks pretty tightly with pest development.
Awesome.
Kim, do you want to add to that?
Sure. I know in the Salinas Valley, there's a pest map app that you can go to, and the researchers in this area track sticky cards, and then they put that information into the pest map app, and then you can see how the populations for thrips, diamondback moth, and one other that I'm not remembering right now, but three main pests. You can see how they track in different areas, and then it has year over year information. So I can share that link with anyone that's interested. Just message me.
Awesome. And then I have another question for you. How many releases are typically needed to control a pest?
It just depends. As Hannah said, it's like sometimes you can do a single release and you get that pest in check. The natural enemies come in from the surrounding habitat, or you've been able to have your natural enemies that you released reproduce to the point where they take down the pests. Other times, I've released 4 times in a growing season. Some pests are harder to control than others. Pests are really good at having kind of protective layers on them. So like we deal with cabbage aphids a lot, and they're fuzzy, and a lot of the natural enemies don't like eating them because they're fuzzy and icky. And then the plant, when the cabbage aphids feed, the plant actually cups and it forms a little pocket that makes it harder for spray coverage and protects the pests. So it depends, or like mealybugs in vineyards, they're hiding out underneath the bark. So it just depends on the pest you're dealing with and like just how effective you can be with your release. I know Anna mentioned this, drone companies and releases and hotspots. So Parabug has the ability to change the release rate in the field. So if you do have a hotspot, you can tell them, okay, I want to put out 10,000 lacewing eggs on these 3 acres and then do 2,000 eggs over here or whatever the numbers are. So they do have that ability as well, some of the drone companies.
Great.
Yeah.
There's a question. Oh, go for it.
I just wanted to note too that I think in a lot of cases, releasing frequently is beneficial, but if you have limits for that in terms of your field schedule and have less releases that you can do, you can look at doing higher rates. It depends on whether that's higher rates earlier. And it really depends on the pest and naturality on whether that can work. But yeah, it's something you do like a large rate in the beginning or multiple smaller releases is different strategies that you can use.
Great. There's a request from Lauren. Kim, if you could share the link to the database in the chat, and we'll make sure that that gets put up on the resources page for this webinar on the Wild Farm Alliance website as well. And then
Yeah.
Lou has a question of asking if there is such a thing as a practice to purchase and release native pollinators to reinforce existing populations, or is it better to increase the population that's already present, not to control pests, but to increase native populations for pollination, it sounds like.
Do you know about that, Kim? Because I have some
Sure.
info
Yeah.
on that, but
Well, so currently there's one main bumblebee that's available for commercial use east of the Mississippi, and then west of the Mississippi, you can only use it in structures that are screened where the bumblebees can't escape uh, because it's a non-native. So uh, I'm not as up on bees as or bumblebees for greenhouse use as I used to be. Um, but my quick reaction to that question would be you're much better just promoting your landscape for bees than trying to purchase them. Because if you plant it, they will come.
also there of course are different, yeah, ways that you can purchase both bumblebees and honeybees, as Kim alluded to. There's also some really interesting work being done on of course, having pollen and nectar out there, but also adding some structure. So some nesting habitat out there, especially for some native bees. There's been work in almonds where you can put out some of the nesting tubes, and it actually can really up native bee, especially osmia numbers.
Yeah, and this looks like a really great, uh, come back in 2 weeks because that talk will be all about increasing habitat and on the field edges and in the field. So it's highly relevant to the next one. It looks like there's another question from Tracy. Could a single row of green beans be effectively drilled along irrigation drip lines in rows of an almond orchard to attract mites and the 6-spotted thrips, or is it more likely to backfire by contributing to spider mite infestation in the trees?
So years ago, when I raised predatory mites, I had a vineyard that did that out in the field. And he had to just be very careful that his pest population, the spider mite population in the bean plants, didn't get to a point where they wanted to form, they'll form little, I call it tinsel, where all the mites will form a line and to get picked up on the wind and then be carried off to the next healthy plant. So you have to make sure that you don't let the pest population get that high, which you can control that by releasing predatory mites into the bean plants at a low level. So my opinion on that is it can be very effective, but it has to be managed. And like
Yeah.
we used to use a mite brushing machine to be able to take plant leaves. You run them through two little brushes. They go down onto a plate that has soap on it, and then you can count the number of predatory versus spider mites you have to follow those populations. So you can do it. It's just you have to monitor it.
Yeah, it can be effective, but it can also go astray.
Yes, but it's a lot better to have some, other habitat than to have scorched earth in an orchard. So I'm always up for figuring out a way to make it work on our farm.
Awesome. If there are any other questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. I just wanted to thank Kim and Hannah for sharing their knowledge and everyone for attending. We would love your feedback, and if you need those continuing education credits, we need your licenses number, and there is a quiz that if you're taking this for DPR credit, you need to take. You can find that in the link, both there on the screen and it's in the chat. There are additional resources on our website that are recommended by Kim and Hannah to check out, including a cool video on hoverflies that Eric, who will be one of our speakers for the next webinar, has up there. And we hope to see you at our next webinar on November 20th. Thanks so much for attending, everyone.